So what is a S.H.E.D? So my S.H.E.D is interested in people, place, and how you can bring people together to talk. S.H.E.D for me is an arts venue, a conversation starter, a dialogue enhancer, and a research facilitator. S.H.E.D has 8 multiple configurations. It's flat packable, it's movable, it invites you to say what you want it to be. It is DIY. It is a space that invites action through social, political, and culturally charged practices. It challenges traditional boundaries and complexities in how we build relationships between artists, environments, spectators, to embrace the non-art community. Form and content of S.H.E.D is shaped by others, not by myself. Its flexibility supports diversity. Its design for dialogue is to capture untold stories from multidisciplinary fields. It plays with the language of design. It transforms physically, and it also invites a transformation in knowledge exchange. It asks questions. How can we design space for dialogue? And how does artistic practice facilitate and create strategies for people to interact with one another? It uses S.H.E.D as a space for curiosity by provoking discourse. S.H.E.D, in this sense, is a methodology that enables us to ask these questions and supports the design of a sculptural and intertextual and dialogic site. What do you want to talk about? It's through careful curation of its configuration, always bespoke in design, for each artist, for each community or individual who use it, to support specific types of needed conversation. Its design plays conceptually with ideas of reconfigurement, of reconfiguring preconceptions of people and place, a shedding of these preconceptions. And in that sense, it's active, it's engaged, it's process-driven, and it's collaborative. Grant Kester stated that the creation of collaborative conversations has to exist beyond institutional boundaries of galleries, of museums, and that these types of exchanges can catalyse surprisingly powerful transformations. I suggest that these include, but are not limited to, the creation and promotion of needed conversations that are active, that are evolving, and that exist beyond fixed identities. S.H.E.D is a physical manifestation of this. It literally has walls that break down in a literal attempt to open up the possibilities for conversations, to produce new insights and understandings beyond the normal limits of social or political forms of communication and engagement, by working in spaces, as Mary Kelly suggests, where people's lives are actually played out. S.H.E.D is a platform to ask, how can we design dialogue, and how does artistic research engage and engineer these alternative sites for practice? But it also asks others to be a part of that design process for conversation. It's a sculptural journey and a strategy to shape dialogue. What form should it be? How do we make that physically as well as verbally? How does the S.H.E.D and other mobile projects like it feed into the cultural, social and political discourses about place making, or as I refer to it, place shaping for cities? S.H.E.D invites us to rethink social relations, as Paul O'Neill calls for an evolving, co-productive process for making. Since starting touring in the summer, it's had over 2,000 people now engage with it, 11 sold-out shows, 650 artists have visited and inquired into using it, and it's got touring dates booked until 2021. I think this is because it's participatory. It's talking about the negotiation of situational, operational, and experimental ways of having dialogue. It's a space that can become a place. As Michael Schwab, artistic director of S.H.E.D, stated, practice should encourage the bouncing of ideas between people, places, and things. Have conversations, create moments that invite new experiences. This is at the heart of S.H.E.D. S.H.E.D plays with Schiller's discursive systems of embodied aesthetic as a mode of experience, and a Kantian idea of how objects can trigger cultural, creative and aesthetic experiences. S.H.E.D is a place to reimagine, an invitation to build and construct meaning of self and for and of others. We can build together. We literally construct and build meaning. S.H.E.D has had young people experiencing going through the care system in this country stand on S.H.E.D and use it as a platform to give themselves voice in a city centre location where 1,500 visitors came to celebrate Derby. It's had intimate one-to-one performances taking place by a young guy called Jake, who's recently been released from the prison system, talking about the justice system in this country. S.H.E.D has recently completed a 5-school tour, delivering sport, art, drama, music as part of the This Is Derby Reimagined YPPF Arts Council funded project. It's shown films from international artists. It's also been a place to offer sanctuary and a space for quiet reflection. This is not a S.H.E.D. It is an invitation. It's wood, it's metal, it's an opportunity to co-design and to be in dialogue.
I'm Victoria. It does say that on the screen, but we'll just guess. I'm not sure why I have been invited here, but I'll just say some stuff and then you can make the connections and ask questions about it, because that's why we're here, I think. My research explores the creative industries and cultural policy and the connections and the dialogue between the two and how people take part in that dialogue, which I'm going to use a horrendous shorthand and call that cultural democracy. And Alex is probably wincing. It. So, is that? No, it's not working. So I'll stand in it. To respond to the theme of In Dialogue, I'm going to talk a little bit about sites of dialogue, and I'm going to use cities as sites of cultural policy-making dialogue as a sort of way into what I'd like to talk about. And so cities really are the focus of lots of cultural policy-making because they have more people in them a lot of the time. And in terms of cultural democracy, Jonathan Gross and Nick Wilson, who work at King's College London, have written a report called The Cultural Ecosystem of Creative People and Places, and that came out last year, and I'll say a little bit more about all of those things. But they talk about the task of making cultural democracy happen, and they say that that needs us to face up to all the ways that cultural freedoms and powers are interconnected with broader questions of social justice, injustice, and inequality. And so there's some important things to say there about the diversity of cities in terms of the businesses that are there, the leisure opportunities, the residential demographics and the equalities. And the larger the city, and this is horrendous shorthand again, and Alex is probably just going to shake a fist, the larger the city, the greater the potential for social inequality. I'm just going to sum it all up like that. So that gives me a way into talking about cities and culture, and to show you the view from my office window for 5 years, which was delightful. And I'm going to read you something from Coventry's City of Culture bid, which says, "Expect the unexpected. Winning City of Culture 2021 will transform our city forever. The young people that are in our schools right now will grow up in a city with more job prospects, a thriving programme of events to enjoy, more places to eat, shop and visit, with a bustling city centre. It's a lot more than a year of cultural celebration, although trust us, that year will be unforgettable. It's about changing the reputation of a city." And that is the beautiful vista of Coventry City Centre. And that just gives you a sense of all the uses to which culture has been put in a city context. And to go back to that diversity issue, the definition of culture that's understood by all the different groups and individuals within a place is really important for me to try and understand a bit more. audiences are people and people are complex, and so there's lots of different definitions going on. And David Bell and Kate Oakley talk about that in terms of cultural policy and interculturalism, and that suggests the need to create spaces and occasions for encounter and communication and shared activities. And just to continue what they're talking about, they say to do that we need to move our gaze away from traditional spaces of culture, if that's the main square or the art gallery or the concert hall, and to acknowledge that public transport, the street, the park, the shopping mall and the airport are also all places of culture. And those places can be off-putting if your definition of culture doesn't match up with what it's trying to present to you. And we were talking about Buxton Opera House, which is here, as a beautiful building, and the things that go on in that building are amazing. But if that's not something that you recognise as a space to go to, how do you get into that cultural language and that cultural conversation? So hopefully there's a link somewhere being made with sheds and sites of conversation. And I think there's an important dialogue to have around the spaces in which people participate in culture, but also the spaces in which they are enabled to have those conversations about what they want, and how those spaces are held open for that conversation to happen. Otherwise, you risk ending up in a situation in which policymaking is a closed shop. This is a report from Demos, which is a think tank in the UK, who said in 2004, so 15 so years ago, cultural policy is a closed conversation and it happens between experts, and what we need is a new language for that conversation to happen, new relationships and a new form of dialogue. So they were using this new language at the time, in 2004, around cultural value, which is also something they saw as being socially constructed, which then means that it's different for different groups of people. And if we continue to develop policy approaches that make the same models, then we get the same results out of those policy approaches and models. In the same year, the Secretary of State for Culture wrote a personal essay, and that's an important point, saying that we shouldn't really need metrics and ways of measuring culture because we know how valuable it is. And she said, this was Tessa Jowell, she said, without an expression or connection to complex culture, I firmly believe we have fewer resources from which to draw on in life. I regard this as a personal heartland rather than a hinterland. And that never made it into policy. And in fact, that personal essay disappeared off the internet for quite a while, which is interesting. But it is back there now. And those metrics and those measurements did make it into cultural policy, and that is how arts projects and cultural projects are judged and evaluated quite a lot of the time, rather than that personal meaning. So 10 years later, after that cultural conversation and report, there was a whole commission dedicated to exploring the future of cultural value, because the implication was that it was in crisis. The Warwick Commission that organised that report, they talked about a cultural and creative ecosystem, which became the focus of lots of my research, and that wasn't defined, and it still isn't defined, and I think that's quite valuable. It's an ongoing conversation that we can have about what makes up a cultural ecosystem in the setting in a city or in a country or in a region or whatever level you want that to be. But ecosystem conversations are, by their nature, deeply contextual. They are socially embedded, and they take account of local power structures and the dynamics that happen there. And I just, in closing actually, because I'm pretty much done, go back to Gross and Wilson's conversations about cultural ecosystems of creative places, and to say, in their words, it's partly through our use of language that we hold open the future for each other. So I'm going to leave that there and hand over to Alex to talk about whatever Alex can talk about. Do you need any slides?
No. Am I all right from a techie point of view, just sitting here? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I'm Professor Alex Nunn. I'm from Social Sciences at the University of Derby. So something a little bit different. I'm not an arts researcher, I'm a Victorian geographer as well. So we've got an interdisciplinary panel. My focus, or the focus of the broad brushstrokes of my research is around inequality. And I've been working on a kind of programme of research for the last 5 or 6 years now, which I kind of titled The New Politics of Inequality. And I try and think about that in terms of both scale and time. And I'm going to talk a little bit about scale here today. Hopefully getting from very big scales to very small scales, or the scale of a shed. So that research programme was triggered really by a whole load of publicity put out by the International Monetary Fund, the World Economic Forum, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, and a number of other organisations. Now, if you know anything about those organisations, you would probably know that they've been lambasted for a long period of time for promoting inequality, not for trying to reduce it. So it seemed to me really quite interesting that they were making such a big song and dance about trying to reduce inequality. So the first step in this research programme was to explore why they were so interested in this topic. And it turns out the reason they were interested in this topic was because they were concerned about the scope for levels of inequality around the world to create unrest and to destabilise societies. And if you look in the news today, you look at international news around Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, Lebanon, and 100 other places, you would see that they were quite prophetic in that. That inequality is driving social unrest in a variety of places, but it does so closer to home too. So the kind of populist movements we've seen with Brexit, the Gilets jaunes movement in France, any number of things in Germany, Hungary, other parts of Europe, you would see a kind of populist turn, at least partly driven by responses to inequalities. Now, looking at that, there's some good reason for those inequalities to arise. We've seen in the global economy over the last 20 years that the number of people that are engaged directly in paid employment, so that's engaged in the global economy formally, rather than subsistence agriculture and all those kinds of things, that proportion has doubled in the last 30 years. And what that means is countries like ours are under increasing competitive pressure. And what that means is we may not be able to sustain our living standards in the same relative living standards in the same way as we have for years to come. But guess what? Of course, in adjusting those living standards, that's an unequal process. So the next step in that research was to explore how the politics of austerity in this country was driving an unequal adjustment to realities in the global economy. Now, people like me, political economists or economists, tend to think about inequalities as produced in the labour market. But one of the real insights of feminist economics has been the way in which formal labour markets are underpinned by the domestic sphere and by communities. So none of us can go out to work and earn our salary today unless somebody, and it's often women, are doing the washing, the cleaning, the childcare, all those kinds of things that the formal economy rests on but are not paid. And if you start to look at inequalities in that way and the way in which inequalities are changing, you quickly realise that the way in which households behave, the way in which they make decisions over who goes to work and at what price, how long to not go to work for and invest in education, what choices to make about housing and debt and so on, you realise that those kinds of choices are increasingly determining inequalities. So if I give you an example, since around 2000, the rates of home ownership for young people have more or less halved. Housing costs for private renters, which is where those young people have gone, are just about 40% of average earnings. That's about double what mortgage costs are. At the same time, more affluent households have responded to signals that they experience about future insecurities by buying second houses. So something like 20% of outstanding mortgage debt in this country is on buy-to-let mortgages. So what you have there immediately is something very new happening, is a direct relationship between two different sorts of households. One who've effectively been disaccumulated, they're not able to accumulate assets, and another accumulating more and more assets because of their own insecurities into the future. And that relationship through the private rental market, mediated by housing and credit markets, is a direct one of accumulation and disaccumulation. You usually think about that happening in the labour market, but this is happening through housing and credit markets. So households have become much more important. So we're going down in scale now. So we've gone from the global economy to the UK state down to individual households. And what what we notice when we look at the way in which individuals are competitive into the future is we see an increasing role for what economists call non-cognitive skills. So things like what we're doing here today, standing up and talking, negotiation, persuading people, even empathy and so on. Those kinds of capacities are becoming more important in determining wages. But we also know that different types of households inculcate those skills and capacities in different ways. And policy has woken up to that over the last 6 months or so. So rather kind of turning around previous policies to squeeze out arts, sports, culture out of the secondary school curriculum, the government has noticed this and has said, right, okay, we need to put that stuff back into schools. But research on the way in which those skills are developed shows that school is not necessarily the best place to develop those skills. So even with that change in policy, there's likely to be a challenge for the arts and for culture to try and bridge the inequalities that will be experienced in the way in which those skills are developed. And a second thing too, if you're at all aware of the way in which schools operate, you will have noticed that an awful lot of emphasis is placed on ideas of aspiration, and that's connected to these kind of ethereal non-cognitive skills. And so secondary schools are crawling with people telling young people to be more aspirational. But in doing so, they often communicate a message, or there's certainly a risk, and this is a challenge for the arts. They communicate a message that says, part of what might be your problem is that you're not aspirational enough, don't be like your mum and dad. Don't be like the community that you come from. So there's a real arts challenge in there, or a cultural challenge, not simply to replicate a kind of middle class or a bourgeois culture in the process of trying to help with dealing with some of these inequalities. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about was, I'm not an arts researcher, but I have been doing some work, some of the projects that Sarah mentioned right at the outset, here in the theatre with young people. And one of the things that's become really, really clear is using the arts with young people is a really good, or with other people too, is a really good way of not just getting to, in inverted commas, rational knowledge, but to emotive and emotional knowledge, both emotional and emotive. And when I was saying about how households respond to existing inequalities, they buy second houses, or they engage in status consumption, or these different types of strategies. Of course, they don't do that through rational appreciation of a barrage of data. They do that in an emotional response to the things that they're experiencing in their daily lives. And these kinds of participatory artistic processes, and in the particular instance I'm talking about, they were drama and theatre-based processes, but extremely good at getting to that kind of emotional responses to societal conditions. So I'll stop there. I think we've gone on and we've used the S.H.E.D in part of that process. I think we've gone on a journey from a kind of a global scale to a S.H.E.D scale discussion, and I'd be really pleased to pick up some of that questions.
Okay, I'm going to try and draw all of that together. So I'm Cara Courage, I'm chairing this session. You saw me there frantically writing lots of notes as we're going through. So I've got quite a few questions or perhaps provocations of my own that I'd like to put to you, and perhaps to draw the three different kind of registers that you were talking across together in some way. You said there was some images that we have, because I'm wondering whether a way to come into this discussion would be to perhaps talk through some of these images. So with the S.H.E.D project, can you explain to us what is happening here?
Okay, so I think it's actually linking with what you were just saying about schools and aspiration, and so that bottom middle picture, I guess that certainly with what you're witnessing here is a workshop which was working with baby people who are a Derby-based organisation that work with music, and we've also got Symphonia Viva, lady from the orchestra there. And they were working with young children to basically become poets, and they wrote music, and then they went inside the shed, and the shed became a recording studio, and then they recorded their own music to their own words about their home life, their place, their school, and without saying what are your aspirations, we were able to then hear from them, through a creative activity, how they were thinking and feeling about, daily life. And that was a really powerful thing to stand in the playground and witness. And I think what's interesting is that at that moment, I think I started to understand how the shed is a vehicle through which it provides people an opportunity to have space, to have those kinds of conversations without it being rammed down the neck that has to be happening, and that it was through this that you were able to then use it for some of the needs analysis in the research that you're undertaking.
I think what's really interesting about that, or what was really interesting about that exercise, is that we were asking some very young children, actually, questions about how they felt about their local environment, the kinds of activities they wanted to be engaged in, and so on. We were asking quite small-scale questions, and their responses were the opposite. So a lot of their responses were big, challenging ideas about the environment. They were concerned about the future of the planet. They were, they had really big concerns. They were talking some of the stuff they did with in terms of the spoken word poetry and so on, were about their fears about populism. So they talked about particular politicians, and they were worried about the way in which that affected issues about race that they experienced in the playground and so on. So their responses were big scale responses to our quite small scale questions. They weren't concerned by that at all.
And when you said that they were witness to that, so the audience as such in that were each other? Were there teachers in there? Were there parents in there?
Yeah.
They were witness to that conversation
Yeah,
too?
yeah. So there were different types of activities that were organised by the This Is Derby Reimagined project partners and producers, and they were able to then curate a kind of a really intense programme of activity that happened over about 4.5 weeks in 5 schools. So there were all sorts of cultural venues and partners that were coming in and delivering different types of activities, but the moments between those activities were just as important. And I think most of us who've experienced conferences can say that it's often those break moments when you're getting a drink or when you're passing one another between sessions where those interesting kind of conversations can happen. And I think that was what was really important about this. It was the after-school activities when we went along and we were talking with parents who were collecting their children at the end of the day, who were kind of reflecting a little bit on the activities or wanted to come and enter the shed again and have a chat. Those were the really interesting moments where people felt that there wasn't an agenda at play, maybe. It was interesting how that... I don't want to put...
Yeah, I mean, that particular project is a really interesting project that's connected to some of the things I was speaking about, particularly around the acquisition of the kind of non-cognitive skills. But it's a project that is really good to think about because it's expressly designed with some of the challenges in mind that I spoke about. So it definitely isn't replicating only a kind of a bourgeois culture, that's for sure. And it's about co-production, it's about participation of young people, them expressing themselves through the arts. It's targeted on parts of the city where we think there's much less cultural participation, some of the young people involved in this project, but also in a predecessor. It was really interesting speaking to their families, because they said the things like, Johnny has been doing this drama, a series of drama activities, never done this before, didn't even know that they liked drama, is now involved in on an ongoing basis, and I couldn't have afforded to take him separately. That was really gold dust for thinking about projects like this, which expand cultural opportunities to young people.
You talked a lot around conversation and then that leading to transformation. So what is that transformation? Are you seeking also some change or behavioural change or something to come out of this? I do think conversation, for conversation's sake, is really important.
Yeah.
But what's the what next that happens after that conversation?
I think what I'm interested in is the way that, as an artist, I'm able to create the space for conversations to happen within. And then the position I take is that I view that conversation as a kind of ongoing, iterative, sculptural form. And then part of that is that I deliberately don't want to define what that end result might be, because I think when we try to do that, we close down the very thing that conversation is trying to do, which is to open things up. So I think there is a range of different types of impacts and outputs that conversation can bring about or call forth. And I think they can be anything from a shift in a sense of well-being for an individual to, in previous projects that I've really used conversation as the driver to instigate some sort of change. It's been permanent sculpture in the city centre, or more floodlights on a playing field. So I guess it's kind of how as an artist you make the distinctions and the qualifications about what conversation should be calling forth or delivering on. And I think that's where conversations with Victoria have become really interesting, about how that then feeds into the idea of creative ecosystems and strategy and policy writing, and how does something like a S.H.E.D that's touring around trying to design ways for people to come and say, I want to have this conversation that's really important to me, and I'd like the S.H.E.D to look like this, and we're going to have that conversation there. It's kind of then how you link with people like Victoria and Alex to say, what else might come out of this other than the kind of personal benefits of being able to speak, which I think is something that's shutting down quite at a rapid rate at the moment.
Yeah. That is a question that I have for you, is linking, I'm reminded in this of the artist Jana van Heesig and her thinking that the community they're the expert in their own lives. They know what's going on in their communities. They've got a lot of the answers to the problems as well. And how does the work of the arts, work like S.H.E.D, then translate into, how does it then go up from the grassroots to that policy level? What happens in that?
I don't think we have an answer at the moment, but I have seen over the last, I don't know, perhaps 10 years, maybe a little bit more, a shift in those funders like Arts Council wanting to work in that way and to learn from them. There's a definite move at the moment from Arts Council England, as one example, to really investing in a place and saying, well, if we fund this and another thing, and get that kind of groundswell of those people having those conversations, then we can learn about the bigger benefits that we're getting for that investment. And that's something that they're talking about quite openly in terms of investing in either cities or regions, and the broader impacts that can have on those people, which they can then replicate. There is a sustainability question about that. Once they stop being able to fund it, what happens with those conversations? But if people are equipped to have them, and if there are those people saying, well, actually, I'm concerned about these things, and how can we work together to solve it, then maybe that's part of the what next once the funding funding stops. So I don't think the problem's solved, but I think there's a bit more openness on the part of policymakers and their agents to have that as a conversation.
And are they actually witness to these conversations then? If they're there in the room, that's a great thing, but if they're not, then what's the translation job? I think behind this is probably a question of Arts Council funding, any other funder, it will be for a certain period of time. Does that give enough time for really proper skills transference to those people who are still within those communities once the art project goes? And this sounds quite a lot like the hard work of the arts and the arts picking up the slack. Again, so we're still in that space, aren't we? I mean, I think it's lovely to hear that, you know, there's going to be arts going back in the curriculum, but there's a part of me that's a real cynic to that as well. And actually, it isn't just our job. It isn't just our job to be doing this kind of work. So are the policymakers there? Are they listening firsthand?
No, and I think a lot of the time they are, and I think that's probably a good thing in some ways, because it just gives that space to have a conversation that's not being eavesdropped on, if that kind of makes sense. That there is more of a mediation. They do listen to the people that are organising the activities, I think, and I suppose with the research impact agenda, you know, universities want to get their research out into policy and into the wider world, so there is more of a push from academic research as well to feed that through, and to make those connections with policy, to really inform from those communities who know what they're living through and what the issues are firsthand. It's a tough nut to crack, I think. So.
Yeah, I think you're right to be concerned about instrumentalising arts as a vehicle for some other kind of policy objective. I think that's a genuine concern. One of the things I think in terms of using art for transformation, Sarah mentioned in the introduction about the +1 scheme here at the theatre. We did some research with and on, hopefully with, the young people that are involved in that scheme. And one of the things that we were struck by was a kind of an internal-external dimension to that project. So internally, lots of emphasis on care, small c care, with the young people and sustained relationships over a long period of time. But that was juxtaposed with an external ethic, where performances and dissemination of the work that the young people produced was intended to shift perception. So, especially invited audiences with particular artwork disseminated to them in a way that's much more powerful than my report. So my report's quite dry and I dare say possibly boring. But those performances were the opposite of that, and you surveyed the audience of one of those events, and it had clearly changed people's perceptions, and people were going away to do concrete things about the messages that they heard. So there is potential there, and I wouldn't write off small-scale change in that way. I was struck. It's the anniversary of the Berlin Wall, isn't it, this month, falling? I'm always struck by the idea that you couldn't see that change coming, and then all of a sudden it's there. And you think about the Greta Thunberg stuff and climate change protests. You know, from one girl sitting there on her own on a Friday, you've got unleashed this huge movement. So I don't write off just small-scale change in that way. It adds up.
Yeah, I'm probably too much of a cynic. I do need to have that hope for myself as well. There's a couple of things in that. So when I, sort of knowing this practice and seeing the photos of S.H.E.D, I know that there's a real rigour behind that artistic practice. And it's really, really well thought out that you'll be holding that space. Do you think that's understood by others that come into that setting?
Sometimes, and sometimes I actually enjoy that people come to it as a shed and take ownership of it, which is a really big part of what I'm interested in it facilitating, is that kind of space of curiosity, that people can write onto it what they want it to be, physically, spatially. So I welcome the lack of kind of presenting it as a research project, because that can drive away the very people that you want to engage that don't have that kind of space to do what they want to do. So whether it's a book group that might want to use it, whether it's a writer in residence program that it's offering, the diversity of who can potentially engage with it and how it might be used, for me, is why it's working. So to close it down and say, you need to understand S.H.E.D's about this, kind of would stop it from having that openness to it. And something earlier that Victoria mentioned made me remember when Darren Henley came here back in January to the Voices Symposium that was hosted here, and he said that he felt more than ever that now's the time to listen actively, and I think that really hit home to me while I was thinking about how do we curate this kind of movable beast, and I think that it's about the fact that it's a listening project as much as it's a talking project. And I think that coming back to the policy ideas of policymakers, and I think that if S.H.E.D just facilitates that equal opportunity to talk and to listen and to reflect, that balance, I think, needs to be readdressed somehow through this, I'm not quite sure how, but I think there's a willingness, certainly with a lot of artists that are working with mobile structures and trying to go into different types of spaces and places and work with people. It's about that readdressing and realigning of how we talk and how we listen to one another.